how does testosterone really impact us on a daily basis? And just because a lab level might be low, what are some other interfering factors? And we've highlighted those before, but there's definitely ways to dive deeper to really know what the interference is.
Yeah. In the last podcast, we talked a lot about environment and how there's so many different influences that will create an environment where you're either absorbing your nutrients and your hormones or you're not. And so it's so important to look at all the different factors that will influence your hormones, because then it's those hormones and how they're communicating that will then influence how you're navigating life, parenthood, your career, your relationships, all of it. So when we can understand like on a micro level and a macro level, then we can put the pieces of the puzzle together that actually fit us as an individual.
Because our hormones are really, they're a dance, and they're in a symphony of many different things, right? So testosterone never just operates on its own. It's operating in relationship to the other hormones like estrogen, progesterone, but also the neurotransmitters, and then like our stress hormones and our, the adrenal hormones. And so it's always has to be taken in context with everything else. And I think that where we get stuck with ourselves, because we have many people that come and say, hey, I must be low testosterone because I'm feeling A, B, C, D, E. Great, let's take a look at that hormone. And then while we're working on helping to support that person with that particular hormone, let's say, let's investigate these other things. Let's also take a look at your inflammatory markers, some of these other things that could be going on. So outside of, and we've talked a lot about Dutch testing, so dry urine hormone testing. What are some of the other tests that you might want to look at to identify some of these other factors that need to be talked about?
Yeah. So the main reason why testosterone comes up for women often, I'll speak from that lens, is the low libido piece. So when they see on their Dutch test and their blood work that, oh wait, it's actually doing okay, it's not low testosterone, sometimes there is a hint of like disappointment, or like, they were really looking for an answer to how they're feeling. So this is where the education around the environment then comes in, and some of the factors that will influence your body's ability to use the testosterone. So like what kind of inflammation is going around your cells that's not allowing the testosterone to actually come in to create that impact or that effect. So we'll look at like heavy metal testing, we'll look at nutrient testing to see like what is it that's blocking that conversation, that's blocking those receptors so that testosterone can bind. And so when we start to investigate a little bit more further into like the upstream causes, because we have to remember that hormones are an effect, they're not a cause, they're responding to the environment. So then when we can see, okay, what's creating this like sticky environment, is it heavy metals, is it fungus, is it a chronic infection that you've had in your body that maybe you don't know of, it just creates more insight into this idea that, okay, it's not just this one thing that I should focus on, it's everything.
Definitely. So let's talk a little bit about heavy metals specifically. So very common tests we run, we've talked about SHBG a ton of times, but sex hormone binding globulin is invoked in your liver as a response to a toxic overwhelm. Could be environmental estrogen, could be excess stress hormone, but definitely it's being contributed to with toxins, specifically heavy metals. So a heavy metal test is basically a urine test. You capture first morning urine, and then you're taking a provoking agent and collecting urine for 6 hours after that provoking agent. It could be an IV with EDTA, it could be oral DMSA, some specific chelating agent, and then you're getting these two samples, one first morning urine, and then the second one with this provoking agent. And what we see categorically is many people, especially with a higher SHBG, have high amounts of lead, mercury, cadmium, arsenic, aluminum. I've seen uranium, thallium. I've seen uranium high, nickel. And all of these things are bioaccumulating. And so Sonia mentioned that these things actually blunt the receptors for where these hormones bind and communicate to our cells. And so where do toxins go? They go to fat. Where's the fat? It's in your cell membrane. And as that cell membrane accumulates, I say it's like it turns them into raisins. They get contracted. And so that affects how that hormone can actually communicate to the cell. and then communicate to the mitochondria.
Yeah.
So that's a really important test to look at, and that's why it's because it's actually affecting the communication, right?
Yeah, and to go for a little bit further into heavy metals, we could probably do a whole podcast on it. It's like you might think, well, I don't have any, but really they're in our environment, they're in the soil, they're in our everyday things that we utilize. So some big things that you might want to investigate in your own body is like, one, have I had mercury fillings in my mouth? Lead can be from the products that we get from overseas. So paint.
Or in our water.
Or in our water, yeah. So the paint in Canada, I know in the 80s, there was more restrictions on lead, but there's lots of things that come from different countries where there are no restrictions around lead and we're still using. Like little kids are chewing on their plastic toys that have paint on them that has lead in it. So there's also the cosmetic industry. So we've talked about estrogen being a problem in the cosmetic industry and these hormone disruptors, but if you're putting on that red lipstick, you have high amounts of lead on your lips that are porous and that it's going into your system. So there can be this cumulative effect, and then there's like generational, because they get stored or bioaccumulated in your tissue, your bones, your fat tissue, your nerve tissue. When a mom is pregnant, these things are coming out of her tissue, crossing the placenta, and then it's accumulating in the fetus too.
Yeah. And there's actually a University of Calgary, I believe it was, that showed a functional MRI imaging, so showing real-time exposure of neurons to mercury, and it was literally like just eating away at those neurons.
You can YouTube it.
Yeah, you can YouTube it, and it's worth taking a look at just to show the presence of this chemical. Specifically, they looked at mercury. I think they even compared it to a couple other metals, but it was mercury that was clearly the most damaging to the neurons. And so, we're seeing rises we as in like research and epidemiology is seeing rises in Alzheimer's, dementia, and all sorts of, other chronic illnesses, cancer, many other things. And not that there's one thing, like hopefully we've said this many times, but it's the accumulation of many different things that are propagating, chronic disease. And so, yeah, looking and understanding what I like to call a total body burden. We reference heavy metals, but there's also forever chemicals. Like we talk often about soccer fields, right, with our boys.
Yeah, which, again, it's so hard to avoid this. So they're all about soccer, but they're on the turf. Not all the time. So like we have to do a better job now as parents to make sure that they're detoxing and then lessening the load by the things that we can control. So we can't control that necessarily right now, but we can control somewhat what they're eating and what they're being exposed to at home, their environment as much as possible. So there's other things that we can do to help support the body so it's not accumulating these. Yeah.
I mean, we can teach them and help them detox, right? Most specifically. So that's one of the tests. I mean, like you said, we could do a whole podcast just on that. But another one that's related to the metals is a micronutrient panel. So one of the micronutrient panels we do looks at mitochondrial health, so all of the micronutrients that are needed in order for mitochondria to run properly. It looks at toxicity load. It looks at something called organic acids, which I know you run a lot. It looks at just the core vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, amino acids. It's kind of like, hey, based on what you've been doing over the last 6 to 8 months or a year, this is your status of nutrient density and all these different areas of things that we need to get through our diet or through supplementation. And when we can know more specifically what we're deficient in, obviously we can target that. And so micronutrient testing is hugely valuable. And it turns out, a big reason why we have micronutrient deficiencies is because we know soil depletion, so just the quality of the soil that the food is grown in, the time it takes to go from garden, say, or if you're animal protein to actually your plate, there's going to be deterioration in the quality of those ingredients. So there's many different reasons, as well as accumulation of toxicity that's going to cause depletion in our minerals or in our vitamins, our mitochondrial health, our accumulation of toxins. So all of these things are a factor in here.
And we've talked before about like which minerals or micronutrients influence different hormones, like estrogen and copper. They work together. Progesterone and zinc works together. Selenium for your thyroid hormones. So we were talking about the heavy metals, and we know that mercury has an affinity for selenium. So if it's binding that up, it's now going to influence the thyroid, which we haven't really talked a lot about, which I'm sure we will in the future, but she's like the queen of the hormone system. So these other things, these upstream things are so important to look at, because we can be taking the hormones, we can be doing the right things, but if we don't have the cofactors like the zinc, the copper, the magnesium, the manganese, all of these, we're still not going to get those optimal results.
Yeah, definitely. So other tests, one other one that we can talk about, we talk about lots of other tests, but one is just like looking at your gut health. You know, you can do a full microbiome analysis, look at how you're breaking down your fats, proteins, carbohydrates. You can look at for opportunistic infections like fungus, virus, bacteria, parasite. And so this is a stool test that we often run in order to get a full diagnostic workup at all of that, including inflammatory markers and basically the tissue health in your digestive tract, which tells us a tremendous amount of information about how we're just dealing with our environmental burden, right?
Yeah, no, the gut health is huge. And I know, again, we've talked about this before, but without being able to digest and really absorb the nutrients from your food, we're not going to get those cofactors that we were just talking about.
Yeah, definitely. So hopefully this gives you an idea of some of these other areas that we're looking at when we're addressing hormones. And like I said, sometimes we just start by supporting the hormonal system while we're taking care of everything else. And there's feedback, support when you're improving nutrition, or you're improving your micronutrient deficiencies, or you're improving your gut health, or you're improving your exercise, you're improving your cognition. And that supports everything.